Off we go. So yeah, at Diane's request, but I think it's a pretty good thing that's overlooked actually, is the impact on whether you choose fresh or frozen, particularly when it comes to vegetables, or canned, and how cooking and preparation methods may vary quite considerably in what they do to the nutrient contents of your food. And I say it's really interesting because in the same way really that we talked about how your digestive system dictates how much of your fantastic diet you absorb and can actually use, so too this can have a big influence, because you may think that you're eating wonderfully healthy foods, but actually the way you're storing or preparing your food might be causing you to be getting a lot fewer nutrients from it than you think. So it's and I actually find it quite fun putting this one together, because it's believe it or not, a topic that doesn't always come up so much, or that I'm not asked to talk about a lot. So yeah, I find it quite interesting myself, actually, just in making sure that my knowledge was up to date. So let's just start off by talking about how you buy food, and I'm particularly talking about fruit and vegetables here, whether we choose fresh, frozen, canned, or dried. And the first thing to say is that what we call the macronutrients. So macronutrients are the nutrients that we get energy from food. So those are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. They all stay pretty much the same regardless of which way you buy your food. And the mineral content usually stays the same. It's more that vitamins and other chemicals that are produced by plants, which we call phytonutrients, that can vary substantially because of the way, not only because of how the produce is grown and picked, but also how it's treated before being stored if it's not fresh, and then also dependent on how long the produce is stored for. So, and all those factors will have an impact on vitamins and phytonutrients quite significantly sometimes. We also have to consider that when we're buying fresh produce, we're just buying that cabbage or those carrots or whatever. When we're buying something that's either frozen or tinned, we more specifically tinned, we also have to consider whether there's any extra stuff added, whether intentionally or not, to the food that we're then eating that we didn't anticipate getting when we were eating tinned carrots or whatever it may be. So we'll talk about that later on as well. But in a very pragmatic and practical sense, provided it's, fruits and vegetables, the food that you have and that you can get and that you have in your cupboard by the end of the week when your next shopping trip is due, that's better than some ideal, or your idea of an idealized food that you cannot obtain. So for instance, I have had one or two, not many, clients come to me before who, because of their health concerns, are so scared of eating anything really that they have put in their minds a few foods that they think will be good for them, and that those also must be organic and they must be locally grown. And there's a set of criteria that then prevents them from eating a wider range of foods. So when we talked about the microbiome, we talked about how important it is to have variety in the diet. So eating whichever form of food you consider to be less ideal, if it helps you to have variety through the week, then sometimes we have to be pragmatic and to let our perfectionist standards perhaps slip. So if you can only go shopping once a week and your fresh vegetables will run out by day 5 out of 7, then of course it's better to have frozen or canned later in the week than to have nothing at all. So we do have to be pragmatic about this, and there is a place for various types of foods in our diet when we think about it like that. But let's talk about fresh fruits and vegetables first of all. It's undeniable that locally sourced is best and makes quite a difference in terms of nutrient content. So it's not just for environmental reasons that buying food locally is best. So for instance, if vegetables or fruit are shipped from halfway around the world, it is likely that they have been picked before they're completely ripe. And what happens is that a lot of the healthy compounds in plants, so not so much the vitamins and minerals, but these other healthy compounds, the phytonutrients, they are produced by plants as a defense mechanism against perhaps being eaten by insects or being subjected to fungal growth or bacterial growth. So plants produce natural plant chemicals, phytonutrients, to protect themselves from attack. And they only produce this when they're about to be ripe and ready to be eaten by birds or have fungus grow in them or whatever. So if we pick plants before they are ripe, they may never have produced some of these plant chemicals that are so good for us and that we assume that we might get from them. So an example of this would be that grapes produce a chemical which protects them from fungus, and that's called resveratrol. And it's one of the reasons why people say that a glass of red wine might be good for you, because the plants have produced this resveratrol. Resveratrol is actually protection against fungal overgrowth. But if grapes haven't been ripened, they won't have produced that. Also, if they are sprayed with fungicides, so if they're not organic, they will never have produced that chemical either, because they haven't needed to, because they've sensed that there's a protection from a chemical fungicide. So we can't always assume that the data that we know of for what should be contained in fruit and vegetables is always present if they haven't been grown to their peak ripeness and picked in optimum condition. So you're much more likely, if you're buying something that's been grown around the corner, to get what you're thinking you're going to get from your vegetables. So obviously things are picked before they're ripe. They're often held in storage conditions to prevent them from ripening. And then produce might be speed ripened just before arriving at the supermarket. Bananas, for instance, go through this process. And it's hard to find research actually on exactly how this changes the nutritional composition of the foods. But there is an acknowledgement in the research literature that it does change the nutritional composition. We're just not quite sure how, and how it varies with different foods and different ripening methods. When food is stored, when it's been shipped, and then or it's stored for a long time before arriving at your supermarket, it will lose what's called water-soluble nutrients. Fruits and veg will lose these. So water-soluble nutrients are the B vitamins and vitamin C primarily. So I've given a few examples here. Apparently spinach loses 75% of its vitamin C content when it's refrigerated for a week. So, and that's from, when it's arriving at the supermarket, not when you've had it in your fridge. So say it sits on a supermarket shelf for a couple of days and then you have it in your fridge for another 5 days before you use it, it will have lost 75% of its vitamin C. Carrots, not so much so, because of their different volume to surface area. They don't lose so much of their vitamin C when stored for a week at room temperature, but they do lose some. Produce tends to lose fewer, or there's a less of a reduction in the fat-soluble vitamins. So that's vitamins A, D, E, and K. It's more those that can leach into the water-soluble nutrients that tend to be lost. So yeah, the sooner you can get something from when it's been grown and picked, the better. If it's from your allotment, that's perfect. If it's from local growers, that or even just stuff that's produced in this country, at least it will be seasonal. It will not have been ripened artificially. There's more likelihood that the plants will have produced all the compounds that you're expecting to get from eating them. In contrast, frozen fruits and vegetables, they're often picked, or usually picked, at peak ripeness. So in this case, the plants will have produced all the phytonutrients that we are expecting them to, certainly if they're organic anyway. And what happens when frozen produce is picked is that it's often blanched. So that's treated at high heat for a few minutes, and that's to inactivate any enzymes in the food that may naturally degrade it during storage. So some nutrients are lost in this heat treatment process, and again, that's some of the water soluble nutrients. And then the produce is speed frozen. So the whole process from field to frozen can take less than 2 hours. And obviously this retains quite a lot of nutrients that would otherwise degrade with a long storage time in your fridge or in your cupboard. So the loss of water, I haven't written this very well. What I mean to say is that frozen produce long term loses fewer water soluble nutrients than fresh produce does. So although some water soluble vitamins, nutrients are lost in this heat treatment, when you compare the overall effect to storing spinach in your fridge for a week, when you've got frozen spinach, it's only lost 30% of its vitamin C during the initial heat treatment, and then there is much less loss when it's frozen. So generally, vegetables and fruit, they degrade because of light, because of heat, because of oxygen. So and then there are changes that occur with putting them in water and with chopping, etc. But when you're freezing something, you are obviously reducing the heat and the light. So it very much slows down the degradation process, and that's why frozen food can last for much longer. But in the process, you're slowing the degradation of these water soluble nutrients that are easy to lose. So the other thing about frozen produce is that you can sometimes get local produce all year round because it's been frozen. You can have it in your freezer all year round. So I'll often have frozen berries in my freezer all year round when I wouldn't, at times of the year when I wouldn't be able to get them otherwise. So other factors to consider when you're choosing between fresh and frozen. I mentioned at the start, meal planning. So even if we used to shop daily or every couple of days, a lot of us, because of the pandemic, have had to either rely on once a week deliveries or else are wanting to restrict our trips to shops. So as I say, if you only shop once a week, and this is something I hear commonly from clients, how am I going to eat so many vegetables every day if I can only shop once a week? And it does require quite a bit of planning to work out what you're going to eat when, so that you don't end up with, floppy celery and wilted lettuce. So sometimes you may decide to have your fresh produce at the start of your weekly shopping cycle, and then later on in the week to rely on frozen. And because frozen foods will have at least as good, will have as good nutrient content in most cases, then that's a viable thing to do. I mentioned that you can get varieties all year round. So if you reckon that blueberries are particularly important for your health, then you can have those all year round by freezing them, and you wouldn't have otherwise been able to access fresh blueberries out of season. However, organic vegetables are more widely available fresh than frozen. You can get a couple of varieties of vegetables frozen. I mean, I shop in Sainsbury's, and I think you can get organic frozen peas. There might be something else. I had a look on the on Waitrose website because I thought surely Waitrose will have more organic frozen vegetables, and I found about 3 or 4 varieties of vegetables that you can buy frozen that are organic in Waitrose. So it's quite difficult to find organic veg frozen. So the balance here, which is quite hard to quantify, is that it's well known that organic vegetables and fruit have higher starting levels of nutrients when they're picked than conventionally farmed products that will have been sprayed. Some of that is because the plants know that they have to resist attack by pests, so they produce these defensive protective compounds that are very good for our health, and plants that have been sprayed don't feel the need to use their resources in producing those same compounds. So the organic vegetables will have a higher nutrient content, and there are quite a few studies that have demonstrated that. How that pans out in terms of, that you start from a higher benchmark, but the losses are quicker than with frozen, where you start off with not as high. No one has studied that for every vegetable type in detail as far as I know. So it's very hard to make those judgments. So I think that we have to be pragmatic and say that, you know, at the end of the day, variety in choosing plant foods is important, however you can get those plants. And you know, in an ideal world, we would all have an allotment out the back and we'd all be eating fresh produce that we've just picked that day every day, but that's not the way most of us live these days. So however you choose to mix it up, you will still be getting lots of nutrients from your fruit and vegetables, whether it's fresh or whether it's frozen. And the variety of making sure that you get lots of different plants is more important than sticking to one or two that you've decided are better in terms of nutritional qualities. One thing that you can do to increase your variety, to make sure that perhaps you can get 2 deliveries of something per week, is to look into getting an organic vegetable box delivery scheme, or there are some schemes where you can go and pick them up. That's a picture of one of my vegetable boxes that I've got. I've been getting a Riverford vegetable box for years now, but there are lots of other schemes available depending on where you live. And I just find that it means it's slightly out of sync with my, you know, regular Sainsbury's shopping delivery. So I've got 2 opportunities in the week to get fresh veg, and it just makes that a little bit easier in terms of always having produce that's not just on the verge of going off. And also it really helps you to get variety. And with Riverford in particular, I'm always very impressed by their interest in the health of the soil that vegetables are grown in, which is another reason why organic produce might have higher nutrient levels, because the soil is better looked after. So that's just another consideration for another place to get vegetables if you don't have an allotment or a big vegetable patch in your back garden. So that's sort of fresh and frozen. What about canned? Canned foods are really like the Cinderella, aren't they? They've sort of got a bit of a bad reputation. Well, sort of from when I think of what we were taught at college as nutritional therapists, you know, there's a bit of snobbery sometimes about canned foods, but is this legitimate? Well, canned foods, when we think about how they're processed, first of all, they are subject to heat treatment well, not quite the same, but in a similar way to frozen foods. So again, that can cause them to lose water-soluble nutrients, vitamin C and the B vitamins. Fat-soluble vitamins and minerals don't change greatly during the canning process. I think some of the prejudice against canned produce is because historically things may have been canned in extra salt, in extra sugar, in inflammatory oils. So, you know, just have a look at what you're buying if you're buying canned produce, and make sure that it's just canned in water if possible. And I guess talking about fresh and frozen, I was mainly talking about vegetables, but when it comes to canned foods, we can think of other things like fish, which is often canned in sunflower oil, which you'll remember we'll want to avoid. So just be really careful of what you're getting along with the food that you're intending to eat. And that's where canned does vary considerably from fresh and frozen, as there may be other additives in there without you realizing it. Another thing to be aware of in canned food is that, you know, foods are often canned in a liquid, and the liquid may corrode the tin. So tins are often lined with a compound called bisphenol A, often called BPA. And you'll be aware that, you know, there's lots of food storage now that's BPA free, because BPA is known to be what's called an endocrine disruptor. It acts like an estrogen in our body. It disrupts the balance of our own hormones. It's possibly carcinogenic. So cans can still be lined with BPA. It's that sort of white lining that you see that protects cans from corrosion due to the fluid that's in them. It's very hard to find out, you know, short of actually asking the manufacturer, it's quite difficult to find out what's lined with BPA and what isn't. So I had a quick look before giving this talk, and you can find articles where journalists or organizations have investigated this, but it's maybe, you know, the articles are maybe dating 5 years back, and companies are saying that they're going to phase out BPA, but it's very hard to get widespread up-to-date information. So it would be a case of asking the particular manufacturer about the particular canned food in question. The other thing to think about is that if manufacturers have said that they are phasing out BPA linings and switching to alternative linings, the alternative may be just as bad. It may just be that we don't have the safety data on it yet. So BPA is particularly known to be an endocrine disruptor, but there's a possibility that some of the similar alternatives to it may be similarly bad. We just don't have that information yet. So also now some companies have moved away from cans into cartons, you know, the Tetra Pak cartons. So they may be lined with aluminium, which isn't always fantastic either. So it's a real rabbit hole to go down, and this will be a different issue for different kinds of canned foods. Very hard to cover it all completely. What I would say is that BPA in particular leaches from the lining more into slightly acidic foods than it would do into just, say, you know, pH neutral foods. So things like canned tomatoes would be much more likely to have the BPA leach into them than, say, a tin of mushy peas or something where it's just in water. So I personally know some people who will only buy, you know, tomatoes in glass jars. That's their decision to reduce their toxic load from the BPA. So it's just another thing of concern when it comes to canned foods. But in terms of the nutrient levels, you know, they're not dissimilar. There's no reason why they'd be dissimilar to frozen fruits and vegetables. So from a nutrient point of view, the actual product itself is perfectly good. It's just all the other things that may be introduced along with it in the canning process. Don't forget also about dried foods. So there are lots of foods that are, again, long shelf life, dried foods that you can rehydrate. I've just listed here some that I particularly, the ones that I think to use. There are probably others. Dried mushrooms you can get, and you can get some unusual varieties that you might not find fresh. And they can be just added into soups, casseroles, slow cooking recipes towards the end, and they will rehydrate, and you don't really taste the difference if they're in with a whole load of other things. Seaweed, as in the picture here, I frequently use dried seaweed in lots of different ways, rehydrated and used on top of salads or in stir fries, or you can just, as I mentioned before, use seaweed sprinkles instead of salt. And then, of course, the dried pulses. Buying dried lentils, beans and chickpeas in bulk dried is cheaper than buying them canned, but of course you need to know how to prepare them. Many will need to be soaked and all will need a fairly lengthy cooking time, but yeah, definitely cheaper and more to buy them dry. And of course herbs and spices have a reasonably, you know, reasonable long life compared with their fresh counterparts. And again, if you add them in to your cooking with time for them to rehydrate, then there's no reason not to use those. So that was sort of comparisons of how you buy the form in which you buy the food. But I wanted to go on to talk a little bit about, once we've got the food and we've stored it in the best way to minimize the nutrient losses, when we then come to prepare the food for cooking it, how can we make sure that it doesn't lose too many nutrients? And actually, when I started thinking about cooking and preparation methods and what we have to think about, there's more to think about than just nutrient losses. So the factors to think about are sometimes in cooking or preparing foods, how we prepare can actually make a difference to how healthy the food is for us. So we can actually activate certain compounds, which if we prepare it the wrong way, we can sort of kill them off. So there's a couple of cases to talk about that. We also want to make certain toxic compounds in our food safer by cooking. Cooking and preparation methods can make a difference to how well we digest and absorb our food. And as we've covered before, you know, our food is only really as nutritious as how well we can digest and absorb it. So that is important. Nutrient losses mentioned, and we also ought to just touch on how cooking food at very high temperatures can introduce harmful substances in a number of ways. when talking about cooking and preparation methods, I have to mention this book, actually, which is, I'm going to stop sharing and show you for a second. I've got it beside me. It's a huge tome, and I just want to actually show you the size of it rather than just the picture, to show you that it's, you know, it's just this enormous book, The World's Healthiest Foods. So this book is all about the optimum ways to store, to prepare, and to cook some of what they reckon are the world's healthiest foods. So given that it's, you know, it's over 1,000 pages long, and there's details on lots of foods in there, you can appreciate that I'm only going to be able to do generalizations and very few generalizations really in this talk. But that is that's really worthwhile looking if you're interested in specific foods, in the detail of how to prepare. You know, if you're really interested in asparagus or mushrooms or something specific, then it's worth having a look. I'll also share the website for it later on, because quite a lot of it is available online as well. So so some of this has been studied in a lot of detail, and like I said, it's quite difficult to generalize. Of the factors I mentioned in what we have to think about when we think about preparing and cooking our foods, I mentioned activating compounds which have nutritional benefits, and that sounds a bit difficult when you don't put it in context. So there's two examples in particular of what this means and how we can make a difference to the nutrient content of our food just by proper preparation. The first one is cruciferous vegetables. So this is the broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, kale family. There's quite a lot of vegetables in that family. And I've said, if possible, chop them 45 minutes before cooking, or if eating them raw, chew them very thoroughly, or sprinkle some mustard powder on them. That seems like a really weird combination of bits of advice. So let's explain why that is. Cruciferous vegetables contain a particular set of compounds called glucosinolates. Glucosinolates don't do very much for us in our body by themselves, but they can get converted into a compound called sulforaphane, which has multiple health benefits. In order to convert the compound that's in your broccoli to the active one that we want to do the job, an enzyme has to act on it, and that enzyme is released when we chop or chew, when we break down, when we slice into that cruciferous vegetable. So we chop up the vegetable, it releases an enzyme, that enzyme turns an inactive compound into a very active compound, which is really, really good for our health. It's a very powerful antioxidant. It sets off a big chain of events in the body. It's has very anti-cancer benefits. You know, there's a long list of benefits from this active compound. This enzyme, we think, oh, we cut the vegetable up and it releases an enzyme, that's great. But if we then cook it straight away, heat deactivates this enzyme, and we never get that conversion from the inactive compound to the active compound that's responsible for a lot of the benefits of cruciferous vegetables. So it's been estimated that it might take about 45 minutes for this enzyme to do all of its work in converting this compound. So in an ideal world, if you've thought ahead and planned ahead and you're steaming some broccoli to have with your dinner, you'll chop it up, leave it in the steamer for 45 minutes before you cook it. And that way, all of the inactive compound will have been converted to the active compound, and you get all the benefits of broccoli that you wanted to get from it. Because that enzyme is also released when you chew vegetables. If you're having raw cruciferous vegetables, just make sure that you chew them very, very thoroughly, and that conversion will continue to happen once once it's gone down your digestive system. The other thing you can do is with mustard powder. So mustard is also part of this cruciferous vegetable family, and because the seeds have already been ground up to form a powder, they've already released this enzyme. So then if you sprinkle that on your cruciferous vegetables before cooking, that's acting on it. The enzyme is already there. So so even though the cooking will deactivate the enzyme in the broccoli, it will still be there from the mustard powder if you sprinkle it on afterwards. Sorry, so I should have said that, sprinkling mustard powder on after you cook your broccoli, for instance, before eating it. So that can make actually quite a lot of a lot of difference. I think it's 4 times as much difference in terms of the active compound that you get afterwards if you sprinkle mustard powder on after cooking. The other food that works a bit in the same way is garlic and onions, that family. So again, there's an enzyme that needs to act that's only released when the onion's chopped or the garlic's crushed, and that takes about 10 minutes to work. And again, heat will deactivate it. So it's, if you're preparing a load of veg to make in a sauce or something, and you know that garlic's part of it, I tend to just crush the garlic first of all, like lightly crush it, leave it before, and then chop all the rest of my veg, and then cook with it. And that's usually enough time just to get that active compound. And the pungent smell, interestingly, that you get while cutting onions is that enzyme acting to convert and make that active compound. So if your onions are making your eyes water and you get that pungent smell, that's a good sign that that process is happening. But you would lose those benefits that you could potentially get if you just cook your cauliflower straight away, or if you just cook your onion straight away and you don't leave it to sit for a minute. So sometimes we think that we're losing nutrients by preparing or chopping in advance, but sometimes other compounds, we allow them to build up. Plants actually make, as I mentioned, protective compounds to protect them against being eaten or being destroyed in the wild. And some of these are sort of toxic in large amounts to us, and we can make some of those toxic compounds safer by the way we prepare foods. So beans are a famous example of this. So they contain compounds called lectins, which are toxic in large doses. So famously, kidney beans are probably highest in this, and they absolutely require soaking and proper cooking beforehand. So soaking and cooking pulses reduces the lectin content to safer levels so that we can eat them. And it's why you always have to know what you're doing in terms of preparing dried pulses. Tinned pulses will already have been soaked and cooked, so you don't need to worry about that. Beans also contain something called trypsin inhibitors. So this is because beans don't want us to be able to break them down. They want to be able to propagate the plant. They contain what's called anti-nutrients, so they prevent us from absorbing other nutrients. So you can sometimes reduce some of the levels of these by soaking pulses in bicarbonate of soda to reduce the anti-nutrients. Of course, we cook meat and animal products to reduce levels of bacteria, which could cause food poisoning if they weren't destroyed by heat. So that's a very obvious, straightforward one. But some cruciferous vegetables, you may have heard this because a lot of people ask me about this. Some cruciferous vegetables, and it's especially kale and pak choi, not all cruciferous vegetables are the same in this, they contain compounds called goitrogens, which may have an impact in reducing thyroid function in people who are susceptible to that. So there's not a great deal of evidence that normal amounts of dietary raw pak choi and raw kale will have this effect, but if you were having them in large amounts, so this crazes of juicing raw kale or smoothies, you can get quite a lot of the raw vegetable. That might have an impact on thyroid function for some people, but cooking completely deactivates these compounds, so there's no concern at all, even if you have a thyroid issue, about eating whatever quantities you want of cooked cruciferous vegetables, or of cooked kale or pak choi, but don't eat large amounts of them raw. I mentioned about making food more digestible. I mean, this is a big reason why, as humans, why we cook. Cooked vegetables are undoubtedly easier to digest for some people and to absorb than raw. We don't always notice this if our digestive system is in good health, but if we have digestive problems, or if we're poorly generally, we tend to know this by instinct. So we give people soup and cooked warming foods if they're unwell. You don't feel like really having lots of grated carrot or raw vegetables if you're feeling unwell, because you just know instinctively that it's going to be a bit abrasive and a bit difficult for your digestive tract. So cooking breaks down some of the indigestible fibers around vegetables so that we can get the nutrients out from them a bit easier. Just going back to beans again in particular on this, so as well as reducing the sort of toxin content of pulses, soaking and cooking properly can help to make them a bit more digestible, because they're notorious for causing gassiness in certain people. So always, if you soak them, discard the soaking water and cook again in fresh water. That can help get rid of the compound that causes some of the gassiness. And also, anecdotally, putting a little bit of seaweed in while you're cooking pulses can help with that as well. Now on to probably the most interesting bit, just about nutrient losses and retention with different cooking methods. Again, this book, The World's Healthiest Foods, is encyclopedic on this subject, but there are a few studies that have looked at particular vegetables. You know, I'm not aware of research studies that look at every single vegetable or every single piece of fruit. They tend to look at one or two with several different cooking methods and then generalize to other vegetables. But so looking at a few of those picked out, again, cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage. So steaming seems to retain those glucosinolate compounds, the antioxidant compounds, as well as the total antioxidant content. So steaming, and not steaming until it's soggy, but steaming until al dente is probably the best way to retain the nutrient content of that family of vegetables, and also quite a lot of other vegetables by extension as well. When it comes to the onion family, so sauteing them, but lightly, not frying them until they're charred or anything, but lightly sauteing, and oven baking retained the most antioxidants there. So quick cooking methods in general break down, as I was saying, some of these indigestible fibers whilst retaining the most nutrients. So we've got a balance here. We cook to make it more digestible. If we cook too long, nutrients start to be lost into the water, into the atmosphere from what we're cooking. So water soluble nutrients are often lost into the cooking water when we're boiling foods. So you'll lose, for instance, quite a lot of the folate content in potatoes by boiling them. But so for vegetables which you can steam, that's why steaming is generally a way of retaining more nutrients than boiling. If, of course, you're cooking something in the liquid which you're then going to drink, like with a soup or in a casserole or slow cooking, then you're just transferring the nutrients from the produce into the cooking liquid, but you're going to eat the cooking liquid anyway. So that's fine. So often, stews and soups and casseroles can be a good way of retaining those water-soluble nutrients as well. As I mentioned, that's the website that corresponds to that book, The World's Healthiest Foods. And like I said, there's 1,000 pages and more about how to, and it goes into quite a lot of detail, like when you buy asparagus, check this and store it like this for up to so many days, and then cook it in by this method for up to X minutes. It really goes into detail on lots of different veg. So if you're unsure about anything in particular, then it's worth having a look on their website to see what they've got on there. The last point I said I'd make was about harmful effects of cooking things at high temperatures, because you can, again, not only destroy some of the nutrients, but actually introduce toxins by cooking at high temperatures. And this applies to various classes of food. So first of all, this was in the news about 5 years ago, maybe you may have heard it. That's a compound called acrylamide, which is carcinogenic, which forms when you cook carbohydrates like bread or potatoes, crisps, that sort of thing, at a high temperature without water. So when you're not steaming, you're not boiling, you're not poaching, but you're grilling or frying or baking something, you get these compounds called acrylamides forming. So burnt toast is carcinogenic because of the acrylamide that happens when you heat treat the carbohydrate. So it occurs on burnt toast, sometimes on crisps, to a lesser extent maybe on dry roasted nuts, those sorts of foods that are crispy, really, that we tend to like, but they aren't terribly good for us. When it comes to meats, meat and poultry, then there's two different toxins that are formed at high temperature. The first is called heterocyclic amines, and they're probably carcinogenic, and they're formed when meat is grilled or charred. So those like char marks that you see on a steak or whatever when it's cooked in a griddle pan, that's the heterocyclic amines, and they're probably carcinogenic. Obviously, there's a, you know, it's dependent on how much you consume of these. So if you're having grilled or charred meat every day, that's not a good idea. No one's going to say you can't have the odd barbecue in summer, but it's to do with the dose that you're exposed to. And there is some evidence that marinating meat in particularly Mediterranean sort of spicy herbs can help to reduce the formation of these compounds. So rosemary is the herb that's been most studied for this, but there's also earlier studies that suggest that other herbs like thyme and sage and garlic may also reduce heterocyclic amines. So if you were to marinate your steak in something with garlic and rosemary, you may then reduce the amount of toxic compounds that form when it's barbecued or when it's grilled. The next class of toxins that form on meats are called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. They're also a probable carcinogen, and they occur when fat from the meat falls onto the flame and burns, or else is ignited by heat from above under a grill, and then the carcinogen forms in the smoke that forms, which then ends up and sticks to the surface of the meat. So it's all about, those, you put something under the grill and you hear it spitting. That's when the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are forming. So again, it's just best to limit your intake of grilled or charred meat. By contrast, water-based cooking methods for cooking meat, such as poaching or slow cooking or casseroling, you can't get higher than 100 degrees C when you're cooking in water. So as opposed to, up in the 200s, 300s when you're grilling or charring. So it really limits the amount of damage that's done to the meat. So slow cooking can be a very, very healthy way, relatively speaking, of cooking meat as opposed to barbecuing. So when we think with vegetables that sometimes we're losing nutrients into the water, with meat, and I guess with fish as well, poaching or slow cooking are actually more advantageous for not introducing toxins. And we don't have the same sort of concern over losing the water-soluble nutrients as we do with fruits and veg. So that was a quick run through. I finished a little bit earlier than normal, but I guess that leaves some time for questions. So I'll stop sharing and ask if there are any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Interesting stuff. I mean, you seem to have it in for barbecues, so.
I think it's a good job that we don't have barbecue weather all year round, isn't it? And that limits us by necessity.
But surely, summertime, when it comes here, surely you'll be all right just to have your barbecue.
Yeah, I mean, all these things, it's just the poison is in the dose, as they say. So it's about balance and not making that your staple intake, but every now and again depends on somebody's health, whether it's a concern, how much of a concern it is or not.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
But we can't get locally produced banana.
No, we don't. No, I mean, you've got no choice there. I mean, they are.
You're unmuted.
They are speed ripened, but yeah, often there's nothing much you can do about that, as you say.
We always buy green bananas and let them ripen. Is that best?
Yeah, I mean, it does. The only literature I could find on it was saying it does change the nutritional content. It wasn't very specific about how, the details of how. So there will be differences. There's there are differences in bananas depending on what stage of ripeness you eat them at as well. So when they're green, they're actually got more prebiotic fiber in it for our gut microbiome. As they ripen, some of that's changed to sugars. So there's a different, then you've got the choice as to when to eat them in the ripening process as well. But yeah, it's hard to find information about exactly what changes in the speed ripening process.
Yeah, a tip that we have also is with your boiled vegetables, when you're doing a roast, we use the water from the vegetables as part of the stock for the gravy.
Yeah, so that's
It's back.
Yes, exactly. So that's like similar thing to cooking vegetables in the liquid or the soup, where you're drinking the liquid then and you're getting that. Yeah, so you're just transferring nutrients around rather than losing them that way. So yes, that's another helpful thing to do. Yeah.
How do you ripen the green banana?
Bananas ripen by being next to other fruit. So other fruit will give off gases as it's sitting there. So if you put bananas, if you don't want your bananas to ripen, you keep them separate from the other fruit in the fruit bowl. And if you want them to ripen, you put them beside your apples and pears and whatever, and they will ripen.
Eat a lot of oranges, don't
Thank
we?
you, Joan. I found that absolutely fascinating.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Thanks,
Really,
Rosemary.
really enjoyed it. And the lovely thing about
Can
your
I-
talks is anything I've ever heard about nutrition in the past has just made me feel guilty. And I have, you know, the last few weeks, all I want to do is just get out there, and I've just got really interested in food, and I've got, it's, you know, a much more positive attitude towards, I've got the sense of what I'm missing rather than that sense of guilt about what I'm not doing or guilt about what I am eating.
Yeah,
So, you know, I really enjoy your talks. Thank you.
Oh, brilliant. It makes me so happy that you say that, because that's what I really want to convey, is that you've always got choices, and food's part of our social life and the joy and everything else. So there's always going to be individual choices, but if you know what you can get from it, then you can make those choices in an informed way, hopefully without feeling any guilt. So thank you for saying that, Rosemary.
I think you found, like myself, sort of the circles we might hang around in, people get paranoid about food, get paranoid about what you're not eating, what you're missing, about all the toxins, and it takes all the joy out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and as I said, I've had a couple of clients, one who would eat cauliflower and cabbage and carrots, and that was it, because she couldn't find anything else local to her that was organic. And you know, that's an extreme example, but of getting into quite a mindset of all the things you have to avoid. And we don't live in a perfect world, but it's trying to have the information to make the best of the choices that we've got. Yeah, and so that's where today, you know, frozen and canned come into that and have their place.
yeah,
Really. Yeah.
I think many of the people who are so big into food, it does sort of border it very much on their mindset, and it's not always the healthiest. So you then sort of lose that joy of eating and enjoying good food.
Yeah, Joan,
Yes.
is there any problem with adding sugar to fruit when you're making pies and things?
Well, of course, any problem, it's adding to the sugar load that your body has to cope with. And I guess a lot of us are exposed to more sugar than we would have been a generation or two ago, when we were more in control of how much sugar we were adding. So when you're adding sugar to a pie or whatever, you know that that's what you're adding. But when you're eating a shop bought pasta sauce or something, and you don't realize that there's been sugar added to that, then you know the thing becomes cumulative, and it's how much your body can process. So some fruits, of course, like if you're making a rhubarb pie or something, of course you have to add some sweetener. I think it's really about generally re-educating your palate by not consuming so much sugar, and then you'll taste the natural sweetness of fruit. So some fruits, I wouldn't really ever add sugar to just making, say, an apple crumble or something. I'd tend to add cinnamon and just enjoy the sweetness of the apples. But if your diet is quite high in processed sugar, then that might not taste sweet enough for you.
Can't do that with Bramley apples, but I put dried fruits in for sweetness. Is that
Yeah, so
better.
then, yeah, I mean, they do still convert to sugar, but because they're coming with fiber, then that will slow down the amount to which the speed at which your blood sugar rises. So yes, it is a bit better. Yeah.
At what stage do you transfer the tin tomato into a glass container?
No, because they've already been in the tin, so they've already been exposed to that BPA. I did at one stage look into, I've since found out that I'm intolerant to tomatoes, as I think I've told you, so I don't really have this concern anymore. But at one stage before I learned I was intolerant, and I was looking into changing from tinned tomatoes, I did have a look at a particular sort of Tetra Pak carton tomatoes, and I satisfied myself at the time that that was a little bit better than tinned tomatoes. So I bought tomatoes in cartons for a while. So that might be slightly better. You can buy passata, sometimes chopped tomatoes in glass jars. So they've never been in the tin. You just buy them in a glass jar. Yeah, but they're harder to find and more expensive.
Hi, Joan. I just want to ask you, the book that you recommended, I've been looking for that because you recommended it some weeks ago. And I've been looking on Amazon, and they vary from price from like £100 or something to, it's difficult to get hold of that particular book. The one that you're recommending, so yeah, I'm still looking for it. So it's a case of trying to find it. I don't think you can get it as an ebook because it's so, I haven't seen an ebook version of it yet. So yeah, that's one thing. And the other thing I was going to ask you, I've got a friend who's recently gone vegetarian, and they're looking to replace meat with tofu. Is tofu good for you in terms of its glycemic index, and in terms of, you know, them replace, they're going to use it as like a, you know, a stir fries instead of having chicken and stuff. They're going to use that instead. So I'm just wondering if that's you know, in terms of the food value of tofu and stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Let me answer your first one first. So I've put the website, which has, I'm not actually entirely sure if it has all the information that's in the book on it, but you will get quite a bit of information on the website, and I can send that to Phil afterwards for him to put.
That's great.
You know, when he puts, so you have a look there, and yeah, it's a big thick book, so I can imagine, I can't remember how much I paid for it, but it's not cheap. Tofu, so it's quite high in protein, similar per gram as meat or poultry or fish would be in protein. So in terms of replacing your protein needs, it's a good source. It's low in fat. I don't actually have any concerns about tofu. Some people are concerned about it being estrogenic, whereas actually it's a weaker estrogen than our own estrogens, and for various reasons that's not usually harmful. The only concern over eating lots of tofu, it's not, so it's a soy product, but soy is often fermented in the Far East before being eaten. So fermented forms of soy would be miso, natto, which you don't get very much here, and tempeh. And when you ferment the soy, it makes it, in the same way as I mentioned about beans, soy can prevent, high amounts of soy can stop you absorbing other nutrients. When it's fermented, that doesn't happen. So tofu isn't a traditionally fermented form of soy. It's made by pressing the beans, but they're not fermented. So if you were having loads and loads of it, it might be a concern for stopping you absorbing other nutrients. But, you know, once or twice a week, it's probably okay. And it's always important for vegetarians and vegans, especially, to make sure that they get enough protein, and it is a good protein source.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Fermented foods are very popular now. How does this work with goitrogens? Because I heard about this 20 years ago, having hypothyroidism, that I shouldn't eat coleslaw. So is it the same, that we shouldn't eat fermented foods because of the goitrogens?
So there's not all the cruciferous vegetables have the same goitrogenic content, and the food tables I've seen show that kale and pak choi are by far higher, the worst offenders in terms of goitrogens. So cabbage is not actually very goitrogenic, and you'd need to be eating an awful lot. I think the concern comes with people juicing or making smoothies with the raw veg, rather than the amount that you would get through food. And certainly if you're having coleslaw and a small amount on the side, you're not sort of having a big plate just of coleslaw typically. I wouldn't be concerned about that. No. One thing I should say about fermented foods, which I really ought to have said when I did the sauerkraut demonstration, and which has been playing on my mind, should have said that you do need to be a little bit careful about fermented foods and any form of probiotics if you're taking medications that suppress your immune system, just because there is a theoretical risk of those bacteria that you're taking in the food getting out of control because of your suppressed immunity. It's very unlikely to happen, but just a word of caution about that.
Mm.
Can I just very quickly ask, you know, when you were talking about carcinogenated food, like if you burn your toast, now, as long as it hasn't turned to complete crumpled dust, if you scrape it off, it's just slightly burnt, you scrape it off the toast, is that toast okay to then consume, or are you, and the same goes for if it's like protein like meat or fish or something that's been barbecued or done on the grill. On the grill, you can control how much carcinogenic effect you get on it, but barbecued, it doesn't. So if you avoid it, does it make it okay? Or
it's a sort of question that's a matter of degree, and it's very difficult to say at what point it's okay and what point it's not, because so I work a lot with people with cancer who would be very much more concerned about having any carcinogens which could promote an ongoing cancer process. So I've always got that in my mind, but it's to do with, firstly, you're not having barbecues all the time just because of the weather, so it's probably not a big concern. As to whether you scrape it off your toast, well, it's certainly better to scrape some off. There will be some residue. It's impossible for me to say whether at what stage that's a problem or not. It's better certainly to scrape it off.
okay.
Cheese grater is very good for scraping off burnt toast.
Good tip.
All right, a lot, Joan. I'm afraid we've run out of time again, so I'm going to have to call an end to it there. But you've got back next week with the oral biome.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
See you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you,
You're welcome.
Joan.
Thank you. Bye.
Joan,
Bye-bye.
it's very
Oh,
interesting.
and
Thank
just
you.
to remember, so we're back